Extras. In episode 36, the party begins to explore Polaron and starts to feel out its ancient Magitech defenses. Mostly feeling it out face first. Polaron is a military facility with good protections against teleportation. Strategically, it only makes sense for the entrances to be fortified and to be able to withstand a serious assault by powerful individuals or by a competent military force. The linchpin of their strategy for this is the focused energy cannon. The large-bore photonic lightning cannon is a massive apparatus. Not only is the projector the size of a train locomotive, mounted on rails perpendicular to its firing line, behind fortified shutters of the same energy-resistant atronium alloy as the rest of the room's plating, but it requires its own independent geoelemental power supply of almost the same size as the cylinder which powered the entire northern terminus. The weapon is capable of sustained high-intensity fire, a beam that fills the entire entry hall choke point, capable of vaporizing most attackers. As the first line of defense, this is very strong. However, there was always the possibility of enemies, particularly with magical preparations, who could resist or even ignore the beam's damage, or use other tricks to bypass the entrance, so the beam is backed up by the conducting golems. Though based on the standard Atronium golem design, this upgraded model was built from the ground up from energy ablating and reflecting materials. Able to wade through the beam, the conducting golems can use their shields to batter enemies, to knock them back into the beam, or to redirect the beam at right angles to sweep through the safe areas of the room, the deceptive spaces, which appear to be missed even when the beam reflects off the angled walls made of energy-reflecting alloy. If the facility was under siege, the laser could also serve as a staging area where Itaran forces could prepare for a counterpush with artillery units positioned behind the pillars for cover, ready to unleash hell when the beam shuts down to let the defenders out. The Warforged Crossbowmen behind the arrow slits, well set up though they may be, seem like a pretty sad defense compared to the room before. The designers put a lot of value in logical, calculated application of power, but they also knew the importance of tactical agility, the ability to think and react to the unexpected. This is part of the reason they valued sentient Warforged soldiers so highly, using them as the main force on the battlefield and treating golems more like armored cavalry support. Also, the power of the creation forges made Warforged much cheaper. Before the fall of Itaran civilization, Polaron's security rooms would have included Warforged spellcasters and or wand users, and possibly even creators, making these spell slits, not just arrow slits. Of course, given that they appear to have died of old age, or the Warforged equivalent thereof, it seems very unlikely these sentient beings would have all naturally died slumped in these rooms together, guarding to their last metaphorical breath. And why were they even here at all after the last Itaran decreed that all Warforged were free? When Isolas Turi died, his commandment did reach the Warforged complement of Polaron, who had already been defending the place without a single Itaran inhabitant for more than a decade. Many of them did leave immediately, taking the trams back to Itara to seek a new life on the mainland. But there were a number who felt very strongly that they had to stay, that orders and creators aside, someone had to remain and defend the powerful installation, to ensure that it did not fall into dangerous hands. Their compatriots argued and pled with them. It's not your concern. Are you crazy? The controller can handle it. You think a band of orcs or something is going to make it up the tunnel? The golems and lightning cannons could repel the whole nation of greens. Remember, orcs back then were dumb, disorganized brutes, and extremely vulnerable to giant lasers. But a small number of these stubborn soldiers could not be swayed. Warforged cannot be programmed the way golems are, with a series of spells during creation which instill basic behaviors or specify additional logical instructions and special commands, nor do the forged have the sort of bounded sentience possessed by intelligent constructs like facility controllers, which can learn and make decisions to varying degrees, but which are limited by Asimovian commandments or by prime directives, such as defending and maintaining the facility. Instead, Warforged are bred or crafted, or whatever you want to call it, with tendencies towards loyalty to superiors and the desire to serve, but as real, living, sentient beings, they ultimately make their own decisions to follow or ignore any order. The Atarans educated them, trained them to be soldiers or whatever their intended role, and given the power differential, you could certainly consider it brainwashing, but just like you or I, or anyone taken in by a cult, ultimately they do make their own decisions, and so, at the official end of Ataran civilization, some of the Warforged of Polaron decided to follow other orders, other parts of their training, rather than the final, compassionate, liberating order by their former masters. Not nearly as many as the bodies found by the party. However, those who could not be persuaded to leave had friends or brothers in arms who cared for them, who refused to abandon them, maybe hoping to convince them to leave over time. There was a second wave of leaving. Years later, the tramps had all gone and none had returned, but enough of the remaining Warforged got together, got the controller to send workers to assist them, as they slowly disassembled, passed through, then reassembled each of the tunnel force fields, the ones outside the controller's command radius. After that, those who remained were resigned to defending the facility till their last tick against enemies who would probably never come, or resigned to spending their remaining time with their stubborn friends. Polaron Controller experimented as much as it could to try and save or extend their lives, but for all its power, it lacked that spark of genius upon which to build, like a clam that needs a grain of salt or sand or other imperfection to form a pearl. And so it watched helplessly as the last occupants faded, died, decayed, until it was alone with only the thoughtless, lifeless golems. The controller had protocols for protecting injured Warforged or Atarans, but not for burying the dead. Such things were handled by the organics themselves, and as the last ones died, huddled together, it could not classify them as waste, or recycling, or debris. It could repair their metal shells, but not their biological parts, nor could it do anything to help them. It had no answer to the problem, but to wait for creator input which would never come. So that's how the party found them. As you may have guessed, this fight in security was completely avoidable, at least in the OMG there are 10 dangerous golems sense. The large number of units in security serve as a strategic reserve to reinforce both the surface and tunnel entrances, as well as protecting maintenance and salvage patrols during times of conflict. So, if the PCs were fighting elsewhere in the facility, particularly nearby, some of these units would almost certainly have been sent as backup. But it's a reserve, and with the badges confusing the controller's strategic view, the subroutine, or whatever it is, keeps seeing friendlies moving around, rather than a small, incredibly powerful invading force penetrating deeper and deeper. One would think that, after losing a few fights, it would make the call to commit a large percentage, maybe 75% of all the forces in the facility to swarm, box in, and ensure the elimination or capture of the enemy. Instead, it keeps engaging in combat, where the individual golems act according to their own combat AI, and its tactical intelligence competently responds to requests for reinforcements, but after each fight, the strategic view assesses the situation and either does not correctly perceive the outcome of the PC's winning, or sees it as an error because there's a conflict between the tactical information showing full casualties and a loss, and the strategic information showing no enemies, no hostiles roving around, and some friendlies in the area. Now, this isn't black and white. The controller is intelligent, and despite these limitations, it knows something is wrong. It knows there haven't been any friendlies, any living facility staff for Itaru knows how many centuries, though perhaps it was suffering from that delusion known as hope. So, Polaron Controller is constantly reassessing and trying to determine the source of the error, and at times it tries to ignore its strategic view and make moves to find the enemies that it knows must be around. The confusion is made worse by the fact that there's another major problem that has been going on recently. Where is the Dark Ancient first known as Temple 1. He showed up by a hologram to taunt the heroes before, he assumed, Gamma would crush them. But they haven't seen him since. What has he been up to? Why hasn't he interfered with them? For that matter, if the facility is all golems, why hasn't he taken it over already? Just jumping from one to the next, leaving them all standing silent, erased in his wake. Interesting questions. And when my supporters on Patreon watched the preview of this Extras, the playwright asked, "Can you reveal how these controller AI constructs are made, or is that too much of a spoiler?" Long before the Dead Wars and the Warforged, the Atarans were fascinated by the problem of creating sentience. Some considered it the holy grail of artificing. Over time, golems had gotten more and more capable, but nobody would characterize them as sentient. When they created the first constructs, they had to be programmed painstakingly. You had to create a magical sequence, like a spell fragment, instructing it to move one leg forward, then move the other. Over time, they built on that crude assembly language, evolving more sophisticated magical frameworks, higher-level languages for instilling actions and reactions into their creations. But as much as they improved and built on their previous efforts, there was no microchip revolution, no Moore's Law exponential curve for construct programming. It was a linear process of improvement that would clearly never lead to true sentience. The Atarans, the great creators, also pioneered the scientific understanding of artificing. They discovered, and created mathematical formulas for, the property of crafting enchantments where simulating and approximating the desired result through physical and technological construction dramatically simplifies and reduces the cost of the process of making magical items and constructs. But here again, they were stumped, because how do you even begin to build a physical embodiment of human-like intelligence? What would that even look like? They kept returning to the conclusion that this problem could only be solved by brute force of magic, an incredibly draining and expensive, long-researched and prepared process. In the end, the first true intelligence they created, the first controller, was a decades-long venture, culminated and completed only by the power of a wish spell. This was not a brash or desperate wish, though. They had built and pre-enchanted the vessel, creating as much as possible of the complex magical architecture to contain not just an intelligence, but an extremely powerful one, and yet which would hopefully, to the best of their ability, bind it with limitations to keep it safe and subservient. And the carefully planned wish spell was cast in a lab isolated from outside magical energies, surrounded by several powerful spellcasters watching for any sign of trouble, and a dozen of their most skilled artificers using devices and divinations to study every aspect of the energies unleashed by the wish. The cost of creating that first sentient construct is hard to comprehend, especially since no society other than the Atarans and the Adar has ever matched the degree of energy and mystical resource management they had. But it was almost a Manhattan Project for artificial intelligence, and they spent a century afterward unraveling the information gathered from observing the wish, and the controller completed by that wish, until they were able to reverse engineer the process. Even then, those who hoped to make every golem a genius were disappointed. They could now remove the costly and dangerous wish from the process, but it was clear that creating a sentient artifact would never be cheap enough to make it practical to build into mobile and vulnerable golems. It would always be something so precious that it must be carefully protected, while at the same time protecting themselves from the danger of a rogue intellect. Nevertheless, the result, the first controller, was considered a great success. It was not the same as a human, elven, or Ataran intelligence, but it was never intended to be. It was probably less creative, but it was capable of great feats of multitasking, memory, and information sorting, sifting, and organization, which ordinary mortals could not hope to match. When set into a facility designed to accommodate it, This controller could manage schedules and reminders for many staff at once, and over time, they found it could dramatically increase the effectiveness of their constructs. They had already enjoyed great success in replacing most, and eventually all, physical labor and menial tasks with construct worker units. Each worker could only handle one or two actual tasks on their own, other than walking to a location. Even rudimentary self-defense would be a whole task on its own. With their greater strength, endurance, and specialized tools, workers greatly multiplied the effectiveness of an Itaran at most tasks, but it still required one supervisor for every 2 or 3 workers to micromanage them. This level of supervisory control could all be replaced by the controller within the area it governed. You couldn't give every golem significant intelligence, but one such intellect could do the same job by controlling and managing many golems or other constructs. It could give simple instructions to dozens of workers at once while performing its other duties. Over the course of 1,000 years of Magitech development, controllers gained the ability to quickly strip out and replace a worker's programming, effectively teaching it an entirely new task when needed, after which it could continue that task with only general strategic direction, such that one controller could manage hundreds of units. Of course, although what they observed from that wish showed them the limits of this brute force creation approach, it gave them hints of other ways to create intelligence in items. Some were uncouth and clearly unacceptable. It would be far, far easier to capture the intelligence, or arguably soul, of a sentient being and retrain or reshape it for one's own purposes. Necromancers had already uncovered such foul methods. But the seeds were also planted for a much better way, a path towards uncovering the math necessary to create sentience using those old, brilliant equations. To create sentience by emulating not some ephemeral, abstract concept of intelligence or soul, but by emulating the forms of existent sentient life. In other words, their search for intelligence had planted the seeds of the idea which, when faced with an impossible threat, they would rediscover and finally realize. Someday, when all seemed darkest, these ideas would help them build the creation forges, and through them, the Warforged. I want to give a big thanks to all my generous Patreon patrons who got to watch this video first and had a chance to give feedback on any topics I might have missed or subjects that might trigger a giant lore dump like that. There's certainly room for more of your questions. Thanks so much for your continued support, with a special shout out to Kurt and Gandalf, the members of the organization. Don't forget, you can catch Draven, Black, and I, along with A Kiss for Luck, on our 5th edition D&D livestream, www.sundaymorningheroes.com. And if you can't afford to contribute financially, or just don't feel like it, remember, it doesn't cost you a dime to like and share Tales from My D&D campaign. Plus, Orestri and I posted a full anime indecision review of Street Fighter II, the animated movie. Is it the one true good video game movie?